have to go create forms, revise forms, train staff, administrators, and in this case, teachers, because we are also requiring that incidences of non-student firearm violations that occur during school-sponsored activities, which could be off-campus, field trip, teachers, you now have to train teachers also. Significant costs related to that, and that's where the cost comes from. Those are mainly my points, so thank you. Sure.
I hate to do it to you, but since you're from Elk Grove, didn't you just have an incident where there were 3 adults in the parking lot with guns at one of the high schools the first day of school?
There were.
And that would not be reported, right?
Correct.
Okay.
But that would not, I have to tell you, that would be recorded as one incident. That incident would have the same weight as a student pushing a teacher. These regulations don't give any weight to severity, and it still would not have propelled Elk Grove into the status of being persistently dangerous.
Right, and I understand, but I mean, I think that just gets back to this dilemma, what we were concerned about when you're labeling something persistently dangerous or not, and even though it was an isolated incident, there was concern expressed about if there's a drive-by in front of the school, even though it wasn't a student or a school. I suppose the media covers it well enough that, you know, it doesn't happen, but I guess it was...
Yeah, to be clear, we're not against collecting the data. We're just, the costs associated with are extreme, and it should be something that the board carries in their decision-making process.
Well, remember, some of you may, and unfortunately it's in my mind forever, and that's what happened in Stockton. And that was a non-student adult who killed, murdered many little elementary school children. And the question is, and it's a tough one, and I don't disagree with anything that has been raised. It's a tough one when, if you were to have that 3 times, how would you justify that did not make that school persistently dangerous to allow those children to transfer? That's the issue that you're looking at. And there are cost problems here, and Department of Finance is absolutely not happy about us saying that a non-student who does a firearms violation on campus, like happened in Stockton, makes a school persistently dangerous if it happens more than once.
I'm sure that would be a tough distinction for parents to make, that it wouldn't be persistently dangerous.
School-sponsored events, and those could be off campus, but it would also be on campus.
I think a concern that I've heard is one, just it's the cost that we don't have a mechanism right now to collect this data, and how do we determine this data? Is it because it's through a police report? Is it through just someone says, oh, I saw somebody with a gun? Is it eyewitness testimony? Where do we come up with the distinction as to what's reportable, what's not? I think, and the other thing is that school districts have control of so much on a school campus, but there's things that they have no control over. And the thing that I've heard from people about is the fact that they're concerned that they will be labeled persistently dangerous over something that they cannot in any way control. And that reflection comes to, perhaps they thought some other way of having a distinction of working with the city or with something else to control whatever outlying things contribute to this, but to make this school suffer consequences under NCLB when they can't keep this from happening is very concerning to some of them.
I'm just going to, I think, I understand your point, Janine, but I think what's really hard for me in sort of wrestling with this, I think the number one reason why people put their kids in private schools is because they're worried about their kids in school campuses. And I think we have adopted a really, really weak definition of persistently dangerous schools. And we can't control everything, but for this to have to happen 3 years in a row, I think puts it beyond the pale of, I don't care what it costs. It's sort of, and like I say, I think these sorts of things get reported in the media enough that it's a problem even for schools who really are trying. But we've pushed this so far out to the realm of making it almost not credible in terms of what you have to do to actually be labeled. It's hard to take seriously this reporting requirement or whatever it costs. Any objection to it on that basis, anyway?
Board comment? Anyone? Janine? Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Sherry Griffith with the Association of School Administrators. We too have some concerns with the vague language in regards to the non-student firearm violations, and actually have some suggested language that we've submitted and will resubmit if you vote to approve a 15-day public comment period. Our concern is not so much right around the campuses, but for the school-sponsored activities that are far away from campus. And a good example would be when you have a field trip in which students are attending, let's say, at the community theater, and there's a non-student firearm violation in that environment with the whole audience at risk. How do you truly report that as it relates to a persistently dangerous school? And so we think that there's some distinctions that can be made in the regulations for those events in which there is absolutely no control. Secondly, if you look at, and this is maybe a minor distinction, but when you look at away from home games, for example, when you have sporting events between rival campuses and there's an incident, we think it needs to be clear in the regulations who would be reporting that data. That's very important because that is a school-sponsored activity. So the language that we are recommending to you would be on page 2 at line 28, where you would take the language as it relates to a school-sponsored activity and define that further to be at a school-sponsored activity on the grounds or property of the school district, and you could expand that if necessary, or in which the district controls the security of the event. We think that's really critical when it's far away from a campus or far away from the school property. And again, that's on page 2 at line 28, and that was submitted to the board office. Thank you.
The board does have that. Thank you, Sherry.
Good afternoon, members of the board, Superintendent O'Connell. My name is Samantha Tran. I'm here on behalf of the California School Boards Association. In addition to some of the comments that were raised about mandated costs in a time of shrinking district budgets and some of the concerns over the definitions and tightening them up, CSBA continues to have concerns about the underlying assumptions that are going to be made if the state continues to move forward in including non-student violent offenses, firearm offenses, in the definition of persistently dangerous schools. I think the persistently dangerous schools policy in general is problematic because, as you all know, schools are often the safest place in communities. Research suggests that violence against and by children and youth happen between the hours of 3 and 6 when kids aren't in school. And even though that's the case, California has been diligently trying to comply with No Child Left Behind and implement the persistently dangerous schools policy. And the way we've done that in the past is by focusing on student expulsion data over a 3-year period. Now, focusing on student expulsion data makes sense for a number of reasons. One, it's tangible data that's collected and reported to the state. And also, it's based on the underlying assumption or belief that schools have some influence over student behavior. To that end, schools across the state are implementing programs like case management, peer counseling, student assistance teams, after-school programs, all in an attempt to support student behavior and to encourage a positive school climate. But what tangible preventative things can schools do to ensure that a non-student who wants to come onto a school campus with a gun to stop that? Some of the things they do is by putting up bigger fences, having more security guards, diligently enforcing their visitation policies. But I would argue that if someone wants to come on campus with a gun, higher fences, more security guards, and a visitation policy may not be enough. And so I know that's probably not the way the direction the board is going to move, but I still would like to argue that the board may consider removing the non-student violent offenses from the definition of persistently dangerous schools. Thank you.
Board comment?
I have a difficult time, and I hear what Glee is saying, understanding how a school can control what comes from outside. It seems to me the only thing you can do is, is the school in a dangerous neighborhood? Or, does somebody who is a violent person live in the neighborhood? But you can't control that as a school. And it seems to me that what we're trying to do is protect, the original intention of all of this is to protect children. But I don't know if by putting this kind of regulation in, if we are protecting the children, because I think it's an untenable kind of activity for schools to do. I don't know how you can prevent other people from coming in or driving by or that are not members of the school community. I just don't know
Ruth,
how you can control that.
I don't think you can. Our job is not preventing it. We're not, cops on the street. What we're doing is trying to correctly label the schools. And you may say, well, why label them? What's the role of that? And the labeling, once the school's labeled persistently dangerous, the children are entitled to change schools. So maybe it's not the school's fault, but it's still a dangerous campus. And once it's labeled persistently dangerous, the students have a right to transfer. So that's the practical impact of it, and that's where if your child were there and it were dangerous from outside adults beyond the school's control, you might say, this has happened 3 years in a row, and this would give me the ability to change.
And so this is all for that, is what you're saying?
That's what the labeling is all about, is somewhat it's the sunshine aspect of running a safe campus, and somewhat it triggers these ability to move out provisions.
I want to push back a little bit on the notion that there's nothing you can do. I cannot tell you the number of times in my career doing research and other things where I've gone onto school campuses where I've walked up to like a side door of a high school in the middle of a very questionable neighborhood and walked down the hall to the principal's office. No adult stops me and asks who I am. First of all, how I can get in the side door in the middle of a school day is beyond me. But the fact that I can walk by teachers and other people who should know who the people are on the campus and no one feels any sense of responsibility over the place to stop and challenge that, this regulation can put some pressure back on that kind of behavior in a school and make it the whole adult faculty's job to care about those things. It's always been amazing to me that can happen, and I've experienced it many, many times.
I also like to think that it might force this, if someone is really threatened by that, the school board members might actually start talking to the city councils about the police. And I think that's really what this is after. It really is about school safety, and I don't think it was intended to, if you've got a problem campus, to actually be able to control it. It's basically, it is sort of a, scarlet letter, a notion of trying to do something that would get people energized enough. And I really think if you have something that bad happening 3 years in a row, there's some real problems. I think it's so unlikely that any school is ever going to be labeled persistently dangerous under the regulations we're adopting. That's why I guess I kind of got exercised about it. It just seems like such a remote possibility in the first place.
And just as a point of information, I think you have about 4 or 5 in the nation, persistently dangerous schools. It's a very, very small number. And you have none in California. You haven't for 2 years.
Right. So there's 3 different incidents over 3 years. Is that correct? So.
And my only comment I would have is that if we're looking at addressing school safety, then this isn't addressing school safety to the way it needs to be addressed. We're talking about reporting. You're saying that it's not addressing the issue. It's just because we recognize that it's untenable being able to keep this from happening. Then what I'm saying is if we're really concerned about school safety, then we should be looking at that in another avenue other than No Child Left Behind in persistently dangerous schools. If we're going to be working with city councils and those things, we need to have a mechanism to make them want to work together. We don't have that mechanism. We don't have that ability. We don't have that authority to ask city councils or cities to work with school districts to deal with outside. We can't even get them to put in a sidewalk if they don't want to make it safer for kids to walk to school. So I'm just saying that we need to address bigger issues if we're looking at it, but not in this forum.
Well, but we still have the federal requirement, so.
Yeah, I think the other thing for us to think about is, in a district like Los Angeles Unified, where probably 20-30% of the kids under this same law would be able to qualify to transfer to another school for academic purposes, not to mention, these purposes. We just don't have the capacity in districts like that to do anything really about it. We have 100 spaces, and there are 240,000 kids who qualify to be transferred. And so I'm just wondering what are we trying to solve by doing this? It's frustrating, and again, my experience in Los Angeles Unified, where all these kids qualify to be transferred, but there's no place to send them.
No capacity. Okay.
I understand this correctly, then. We are complying with a No Child Left Behind requirement by making a policy, right, that probably won't be used because there's only 3 or 4 of these in the whole country, but we have to do this. And you're saying, Suzanne, that maybe it just wakes up, a campus into being a little more secure. But it also seems to me that we're doing this because we're not thinking through the real ways to protect children. We're only fulfilling our requirement to make a policy. And it seems to me that's a bad way to make policy. It's to do it because we're forced to do it, and it makes no sense to me, because it doesn't make any sense that we have to make this label, we have to make this process, we have to find a reporting system, and we have to do this because it fits into a national requirement. I don't get the rationale.
Though remember that I think that's a very good point. And you could do both. So you do the check of the box for the feds that says, okay, we've given you your policy that you've insisted so we can get the $1.9 billion very well. And then on the state level, where you want to do some real policy to do something for kids, you do that separately. And you can do that anyway. So I think that may be a conversation that you want to engage in. What do you do about that? It's a very complicated issue, and I think you've heard some of that raised here. I think the concern that you're hearing from the audience, and you'll get it in the comment period as well, is the reporting requirement. That's what they're concerned with, as well as the school-sponsored events, like a community circus, kind of thing. And those are valid concerns. So I think you need to separate them. I wouldn't want you to think that one forecloses the other. It is frustrating to have to check the box, which is what you're pursuing right now. But you can always key up to have that broader, important policy conversation.
You need a motion to go to comment period. I mean, we're not voting on the issue today,
Correct.
but just go to
I was
comment
gonna
period.
bring
So
that
I'd
up.
like to make that motion.
Okay, thank you, Janine. And let me read that out. It's long. The motion would be direct staff to send out a revised proposed regulation for persistently dangerous schools for a 15-day public comment period. If no objections to the revisions to the regulations are received during the 15-day public comment period, direct staff to complete the rulemaking package and submit it to the Office of Administrative Law for approval. And if objections to the revisions to the regulations are received during the 15-day public comment period, direct staff to place the regulations on the board's November agenda. Janine, and then second on that? Glee? All those in favor? Any opposed? Okay, motion carries, passes unanimously. Thank you very much. That's a tough topic. Okay, on to item 19. More NCLB. Hello, Sue.
More NCLB. This time, let's change the subject a little and go to reading first.
Sue, may I interrupt you just for a moment? Deborah, thankfully, had copied a last-minute memorandum from Gino on the CELT subgroup results. So I just wanted to draw that to everyone's attention. Thank you. Can everybody hear that? Did you hear? Right. Okay, it's in the back of the room, and it's May 2003. Okay, Sue, thank you.
All righty. I'm here today to ask that you approve the proposed application review process for a special education referral reduction program in the area of Reading First. The 2004-2005 State Budget Act directs that the first priority for use of Reading First carryover funds is to increase grantees to $8,000 per K-3 teacher upon submission of a plan to reduce the number of referrals to special education and provide alternative assistance to pupils in the Reading First program in the form of good diagnostic instruction. You also have a last-minute memorandum, a blue, and this one is a blue one, that asks a couple of changes be made to this item. One, to change the definition of students in need on page 3 of 6 in attachment 3. And then to pull the chart on page 5 of 6 so that we can further refine it and make sure that it is compliant with IDEA. And then to change the due date for submitting applications to the Department of Education to November 15th. And then also say that the grants will be, the districts will receive information about approval by December 15th. And then the last thing in the last minute item is a list of appropriate supplemental materials for use in this program will be brought to the board for approval in November.
Do we have any board comment on this? And do we have one? Okay, and a speaker?
Martha Diaz with the California Together Coalition. The budget language is two parts to the budget language for the Reading First, and I just would like a clarification. The first part of the budget language referred to the alternative programs and their eligibility to receive the Reading First funding. And there was much discussion at the budget subcommittee and the full committee in regards to ensuring that alternative programs in rounds 2 and 3 receive funding first from the carryover and then use the monies for the special ed. And so it's unclear to me in terms of the information that you all were provided of the 112 districts participating in rounds 1, 2, and 3, how many of those are the alternative programs and whether the $13.6 million are sufficient to fund all of the applications submitted by alternative programs for the Reading First funds. And that's my question.
It took me a little bit of time to figure out where we were, but I did have some questions on this, and I don't know if you're the right person to do this, but the two questions that I had on this were...
That would be Sue who can answer your questions. Thank you.
What is the philosophy behind reducing the referrals? I have three questions. Is Reading First an indicator of special ed? And then there was a research on page 3 of 6 where it says it is now known that children do not outgrow reading problems. And I wanted to know what that was research was based upon.
Okay, well, first of all, I think your first question was, is Reading First an indicator of special education, correct?
Well, it's my second one, but that's fine.
All right, so let's go with that one. Evidently, I don't have long-term memory skills. Okay.
Mine are written down, so that's how I can tell you.
Anyway, first of all, Reading First is not an indicator of special education. Reading First is a program that we began several years ago to work with schools that have children that are struggling with their performance in the area of reading. It's for grades K-3 students. What this new edition of the funding does, going from $6,500 per teacher up to $8,000 per teacher, is it allows a district to work with school sites to make sure that children are not identified for special education unless it's really necessary. Frequently in education, we find that children are referred for testing in special education, and more frequently than not, when the testing is done, what we find with this good diagnostic assessment is that they need very focused instruction, they need intervention, but they do not need to be identified as a special education student. And so the purpose of these funds is to focus on that effort and to be proactive with children that are in danger of this identification rather than reactive down the road.
Ruth, this is a really important issue, and it's based on an early intervention prevention model. And in the because right now special ed is set up, they call it weight to fail, because the students are assessed when they're 2 grade levels behind in achievement, or 4th graders performing at 2nd grade or something like that. And what that does is set up that they don't get the help they need until it's later on in their academic career, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, or they call it weight to fail. So this is going in the other direction, and you identify kids early on, and this can be done through oral skills, for example. It doesn't have to do with reading, and so where they can identify kids early on and get them the help they need. So it will eventually, hopefully, this will do what it said it's going to do, is keep more kids out of special ed, get them the help they need early on, and they'll be doing much better in their academic career. So it's being done in certain districts. I know Elk Grove has done this. We have a pilot in Santa Barbara. It's done well, and so it's being done in various places around the state. But
So the money is given to teachers to identify the kids early and then do the intensive kind of one-on-one that is needed to bring them or keep them to grade level?
Right, the money for the assessments
Yeah.
and then the interventions to follow with the
Gonna
materials. And
say,
Sue can talk about it
actually,
more.
the increased funding can go for things like purchasing diagnostic assessments. So
Okay.
those diagnostic assessments can be provided, training teachers in the use of those diagnostic assessments, and then providing intensive professional learning for teachers so that they can then help students so that we do get a handle on their reading problems early on rather than further down the road.
No, I totally see the need for that.
What the district is going to do is submit a plan. A place like Elk Grove, for instance, already has something in place, and so they would submit a plan. But there are some places in California that I don't think have given as careful thought to this as they could. And so this will be an opportunity to work with the RTACs and the CTACs, the Reading Assistance Centers, throughout in the Reading First process, to further refine what it is they're doing in their school district in developing their plans.
Could you please respond to Mrs. Aragota Diaz's question so that it's not...
I think actually Karen was going to
Oh, great.
respond to that.
Right.
I could, but go ahead.
Thanks. So the answer is that all the alternative classes have been included in the cohorts. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that up, Joe. I meant to ask that as well. Okay. Any other, we have another public speaker, is that correct? Okay, Sherry?
Sherry Griffith with AXA. We are in strong support of the policy. We think it's going in the right direction. And frankly, a lot of our instructional leaders would like to see it at the higher levels as well. But we are very pleased with the policy that is before you.
Thank you. And anyone else?
Sylvia DeRuvo, California Association of Resource Specialists and Special Education Teachers. This is very positive information. The waiting to fail is something that is very frustrating to us as special education teachers. At a school of 300, I might assess 40 kids a year, and of those 40, less than half usually do qualify. And so the idea of early intervention is a wonderful idea. My only, and I know you're working on page 5 of 6, is the definition of small group. To some people, a small group is 20, because it says the instructional strategies, it says small group technical skills, small group, small group. 20 is a small group to some, 12 is a small group to some, 5 is a small group to some. I think we need to define what that small group is. I was recently at the Research to Practice Summit in Washington, D.C. with the U.S. Department of Ed, and Donald Deschler from the University of Kansas shared information about intensive small group instruction, working actually with older students, where they had groups of 5, and they did between 4 and 6 weeks, 6 weeks, and several month intervention with students and made tremendous progress. So I think we need to look at what a small group is and make sure that we keep the groups small, because research is showing small group intensive instruction makes a tremendous difference.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
that. Okay, any other board comments? Okay. Then the motion would be to approve an increase in grant award as provided in item 6110-126-0890 of the 2004-05 budget for those districts that submit a plan for reducing the number of referrals to special education that is consistent with the process of multi-tiered prevention intervention as recommended by staff and revised in the last-minute memorandum and with other technical corrections approved by the executive director. Do I have a motion? Ruth, seconded by Glee. All those in favor? Any opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Okay, on to item 20, ISUSP.
Good afternoon, Wendy Harris, School Improvement Division, and I'm here for the next several items, it looks like. Item 20, you should have a last-minute memorandum, and item 20 recommends that we commence the process of rulemaking related to the concept of significant growth as it's applied to the high priority schools and the IIUSP schools. Just to kind of remind you what the statute says, it says that any school that does not meet its targets but makes significant growth, which is mentioned in statute but left to you to define, continues to participate in the program until it either exits by making its targets or it fails to make significant growth and it becomes state monitored. The funding, meanwhile, stops after a prescribed period of time. And so over the last couple of years, I'm sure you'll remember, we've recommended and you've approved the designation of certain schools as state monitored. And then when you adopted a definition last July for significant growth for the high priority schools, you asked that we bring back regulations in September to implement this policy. So here we are. And the proposed regulation that you have in your packet, in your last-minute memorandum, would really do two things. It would specify first a clear standard to determine the eligibility of a school for the continued participation in the program by establishing a distinction between a school that fails to achieve any growth and one that achieves its growth targets. So it very clearly defines no growth and targets. And then the second aspect of the regulation is to determine if a school without a valid API would demonstrate significant growth. And again, what this proposed regulation does is implement the policy that you adopted last year to deal with schools without valid APIs by using a measure of increase of percent proficient from prior year to current year, or the year before the school had an invalid API to the year in which it had an invalid API for both language arts and mathematics. So I can answer questions on the regulation. Once you approve the commencement of rulemaking, we will have the public hearing on November 2nd, and then we'd be back at the November board with the results of the hearing.
Board comment on that? And do we have any public speakers, Tiffany? No? Okay. All right. The motion would be to approve the commencement of the regulatory process for the proposed regulations regarding the definition of significant growth for IIUSP and High Priority Schools Grant Program with the technical modifications that may be identified and incorporated by staff, subject to the approval of the Executive Director of the State Board, and direct staff to commence the rulemaking process. Approve the initial statement of reasons and notice of the proposed rulemaking with any necessary technical modifications, and direct CDE staff to conduct a public hearing on the proposed regulations.
So moved.
Thank you, Reed. Okay. Joe? All those in favor? Okay, any opposed? All right, the motion carries. Thank you.
Thanks. Item 21, and you also have a last-minute memo for this item. This is an item that contains the recommendation for designating another group of IIUSP schools as state monitored and to assign them a SATE team. And this is based upon the August 31st school-wide API data release. And I thought I would just walk you through the tables in the last-minute memorandum for just a second and show you what you're looking at. Table 1 contains a list of schools that were participating in the first two cohorts of IIUSP. Their funding has terminated at this point, and yet the schools never exited because they didn't make their growth targets. They remained on watch, and the statute says that if a school in this situation in any year fails to make significant growth, so it fails to make any positive growth according to your definition you've adopted, it would become state monitored. So in the far right-hand column, you'll see all negative numbers, negative growth, or zero in one or two cases. In Table 2, you have just a single school, and that's a school in the third cohort of IIUSP, and the third cohort has just finished their first 2 years of funding. So this school actually failed to make significant growth in 2003 and then in 2004 as well. 2 years of failing to make significant growth, or red as we sometimes call it, means that it is subject to being state monitored. And then finally, the last table, Table 3, has about maybe 17 schools that do not have a valid API, and without such a valid API, they can't demonstrate positive growth. So what we're recommending, taking the last table first, is that we actually, we would recommend that you delay action on the schools in the last table until November. That would, and that time period would allow us to apply the alternative criteria that were used last year and that are also being proposed in regulations to determine whether any of these schools made significant growth. And then we would also recommend that you would designate those schools in tables 1 and 2 as state monitored, that a SATE be assigned to these schools, and that we allow in each case the local board to retain its legal rights, duties, and responsibilities with respect to the school. So those are our recommendations. You have, as is usual with this program, quite a variety of schools in all sorts of deciles with all sorts of performance. We've faced this before, but that's the statute is the statute. So these are the data, and those are our recommendations.
How do you decide who to send to these schools?
The schools can select their own team from among the organizations which have been approved using the criteria the board had adopted. We have 48 or so organizations and at least 100 leads for these teams. So,
and the fees are non-negotiable. It's a set.
The fees are actually set in statute, yeah, for this work.
Actually, if you don't mind, Wendy, if you could give the new board members a little bit of history regarding how we got to SATE. There wasn't, I know it's painful, and I don't mean to like dredge up our dirty laundry, but there was a process that was being used that schools and teachers really felt was not being very helpful, and we ended up here I asked you to talk to it, and then I go on and on. So if you could...
Happy to, or you're doing a good job, but
anyway, we ended up working with Wendy and their department to come up with this SATE process that is more focused on the practice that's going on in districts, the more practice that's going on in English language arts and math, that is focused on the instructional program, and it seems to be working much better for those schools that have been identified. My concern is there's so many schools on these lists. Do we have the capacity to handle these numbers?
Honestly, I think capacity is tight, but I think it's there. The counties have been particularly diligent in building the capacity of their own staff beyond where we were a year ago. So a little bit better capacity within the county offices as one source, and everybody has learned together on this. So I think we'll be okay.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Let's hear the public speaker, please.
Stephen Rhodes. I represent, actually I'm speaking on behalf of LA Unified today, and work for Strategic Education Services. You will receive a one-page handout. This also refers actually to the prior item. And basically, my main thrust today is to urge you to give you as much flexibility as possible when you make these decisions. These are very, very important decisions, have tremendous impacts on the schools. The schools that are sent these SATE teams, this is not regarded as a positive thing. It's regarded that they have failed. And it impacts the principal, the teachers, the public in a very negative way. And you want to make sure that when you make these decisions, that they are the correct decisions and the fair decisions,
and that a school can't take a look at a neighboring school that's done worse and was in the same program and did not receive a SATE team. So I would just urge you, and I'll give you some examples and some comments, to just try to be as flexible and give yourself as much freedom as possible for this process. My first comment concerns contacting the district and making sure that and understanding what the district has already done to these schools. They may have assigned a management team. They may have replaced the principal. They may have done some of the other options that are on page 2 of your agenda. And you want to make sure that what you do fits with that activity and doesn't destroy that. And so that's my first comment. My second comment is to take a look at the overall 3-year performance of these schools.
Wrap it up quickly, please.
And I've given a couple examples of some schools that have done very well, and there's other schools from San Francisco, San Bernardino, Oakland, and Folsom Cordova that have done even better. The third comment concerns making sure you're consistent with AYP. There's a school I've given from LA Unified that has met all its AYP requirements, has done very, very well, but it's going to fail the test that you did because it has a 2% decline in the English language arts. And it seems to have a pretty high API score. I would just try to be as consistent as possible, and again, give yourself as much flexibility as possible.
Thank you very much for those comments. Okay. The motion, you're all set, aren't you? No, okay. Any other board comments? Did I hear that? No, okay. Another long motion. This would be to, 1, require the districts of the schools with valid APIs identified in the agenda item in tables 1 and 1 to enter into contracts with school assistant SATE teams because the schools have failed to show significant growth as required by law, and allow the governing board of each school district to retain its legal rights, duties, and responsibilities with respect at each state-monitored school within its jurisdiction, and 2, postpone until November a decision on those schools without valid APIs in Table 3 to determine if they need alternative criteria for...
And if I could add...
Thank you. Just checking. For significant growth.
And I'd like to add one thing to the very long motion, which is Table 1 and Table 2.
Okay. So we need a motion. Anyone? Okay. Reed made the motion, seconded by Bonnie. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. Oh, okay. Oh, good. I just said that like there were enough people here for a quorum. Okay. All right. We are now on item 22, and we are ready to go back to work, everyone, because we want to get through this meeting. And I know Wendy is ready to roll. Take it away.
Roll. Item 22, simply an expenditure plan we're submitting for your approval, which follows the format of that last item 21. The only difference, Table 3 contains an expenditure plan for just continuing the corrective action funding for schools that became monitored either last year or the year before and haven't yet exited. The formulas for this are all in statute, but the Budget Act requires your approval so we can get the money out.
Okay. Is there public comment on this? Okay. Board comment. Any discussion on this one? Okay, the motion would be to approve the expenditure plan to support state activities and corrective actions in state-monitored schools as recommended by staff. Glee, seconded by Suzanne. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay. All right, on to item 23.
Okay, item 23, now we're talking about the high priority or HP schools. And as I mentioned a couple times in the seminar and last July when you adopted the significant growth definition, this fall you have an opportunity as soon as the data are released on October 21st to look at how the high priority schools are doing after their first 2 years of implementation. And this item has to do with a procedure for how we're recommending that you review the performance of these schools and potentially take some early local corrective action for those schools that are not doing very well. And the statute says that any high priority school that has not met its growth targets for each of the first 2 years of funding shall be subject to a review by the board, and that review needs to include an examination of the progress of the school in relationship to the annual report information that it submits to us. But then the statute goes on to be permissive and further permit the superintendent, with the board's approval, to take any appropriate action to provide some corrective assistance to schools that are not doing well so they can achieve their benchmarks. So the purpose of this item is really twofold, I think. To first seek your concurrence with a procedure for how we would simply bring the data to you. This would be in November for any high priority school not meeting their targets the first 2 years. Now, there's going to be a large number, we think, of these schools. We don't know how many yet. And we feel that the most salient data that we would bring to you are their API growth targets for comparable improvement and school-wide for their first 2 years. And then secondly, we're seeking your approval of our plan or our idea that we would then take these schools that we bring to you, the data for these schools, and basically divide them into 2 categories and propose a different set of actions for each category. So for those schools that end up making significant growth but not meeting their targets, we would recommend that a letter be sent to them that would require their local board to conduct a public hearing so that the local community can be informed about the lack of progress of the school. And I need to point out that this kind of an action would be entirely consistent with what IIUSP actually requires in statute after a single year and what we ended up doing for those IIUSP schools in the same situation. But then for those schools that actually made no positive growth for both years, we would recommend that they would be required, in addition to doing the hearing, to start on the SATE process by completing what we call the academic program survey, which focuses on the essential program components. Joe was starting to talk about the revised process. And the district would then be directed to work with those schools on corrective actions pending the results of that survey. So in essence, an early start locally on the SATE process, not waiting till these schools reach the limit of the program and the limit of the funding, but get them started early on some corrective actions. So I guess if you concur with this plan, we would be back in November with both the data and then the schools divided up in that way. And then if you have some further recommendations about something else you'd rather see, we'd be happy to hear them now.
Wendy, could you give me a timeline on this in terms of, it seems to extend it out a little bit, and I'm just wondering, and this is the tension between, what the local boards should be doing and increasing their academic achievement in their districts. But if you're a high priority school to begin with, so give me a time frame. Let me frame this for me, and then we're saying how many months later then there's the letter, and it seems a little bit too little too late, but that the local district should step up a little sooner in all of this. I know we don't, we can direct the governing board to do this academic survey and that sort of thing, but they really need to take action. So help me out here a little bit on the time frame.
In IIUSP, the program is either a 2 or a 3-year program. The high priority program is a 3 possibly, but more likely a 4-year program of funding and support. So in IIUSP statute, the statute actually says that the district must conduct this kind of a local hearing after the first 24 months. And the HP statute was written to require a review after, after 12 months. The HP statute was written to require such a review after the first 24 months. I believe it just contemplates a slightly longer program period.
Right, because it says both years of implementation. Right. Okay, so that's 2 years out, and then you start the letter, and
you look at them and so forth. We could start after a single year. The statute doesn't contemplate that. You know, we could have. We didn't contemplate doing that a year ago.
Okay. And these are decile
one.
Right, that's what I thought. Okay, so they're in trouble. So, and then 2 years later, then we're talking about these actions.
That's correct.
Meaning a child could be start in the 2nd grade, and it's not until the 4th grade that we're taking action.
Right, that's my quandary. I mean, this all makes sense. It's just, how can we?
Well, wait, because the school is taking action in the first 2 years.
Right.
So what the legislature did is they made a decision that they wanted it to be handled at the local level initially. Now, you could argue about that choice, but that's the choice they made. So the first 2 years, you're giving them a chance. Then, if you're here and they've done nothing, or whatever they did didn't show any results, now what you're supposed to do under the statute, or you may do, is tell the governing board, I'm sorry, what the school was doing is not working. You do something else, and you can tell them. And what Wendy has suggested is that you do this academic program survey similar to what you do in state. And I think what Ruth is putting out there, and I can sense in the room and watch your facial expressions, that you're frustrated with the slow pace, and that you're not moving forward. And there's good reason for that. That's how the statute is written. Now, you can talk about what you could have the governing board do more than the academic program survey. And we were wrestling with this but ran out of time because the agenda was
But
here.
Ray, does the statute say when it says gives the locals a chance to fix it, does it say you have to wait 2 years?
Yes.
And give the locals 2 years?
Yes. It says after 24 months, and then it has another step after 36 months. So yes, the legislature made those
So
choices.
within the legislative parameters, you're saying our choices are what we do after 24 months, and can we do something a little more action-oriented than a survey?
With a school that is decile 1,
Yes.
you know, it's there
Well,
already. So.
Right.
The volunteer programs, which I just found out, that first group of schools we were talking about, that they have higher scores, and we go and intervene after 12 months?
Well, a local hearing is the first step of the intervention after 12 months.
After 12 months, but they could be performing much, much higher than these schools, and we have to wait 24 months. Hello? What's wrong with this picture? Doesn't make sense.
Right. Right. They're seeking answers a little bit more proactively than perhaps some other districts. So
And
it just
so
depends.
What I try to help the board understand is the difference between a frustration with legislation and a frustration on what Wendy's bringing forward, because it would be a little unfair to be frustrated with Wendy on the legislation. So the issue before you is the suggestion that she's made is that you do this academic program survey and that you direct the board to take action based on the results of that survey. So what, in addition, would you like to direct the board to do? And you have that authority. Now, if you don't come up with it right now, it doesn't mean you can't ever come up with it. And I think that Wendy's going to bring the data forward, which may give you some creative ideas for how you might do something more.
If we were talking about doing more, I would really want to have a little more time to think about it than voting on it right now, because somebody suggested that we do something more.
Well, that's what I'm suggesting,
Yeah.
that you could go the way Wendy's describing, at least right now, in theory, and then bring the data back, and then you could make a decision about what more might be, and keeping in mind the capacity issues that she raised in the item before.
I have two other questions to go along with this thing. First of all, how many schools could we be talking about?
Okay.
And then in just using what the gentleman from LA Unified quoted the educational code section 52055.5 that these are pretty stringent kinds of things that could happen to a volunteer school that could be performing on a high level but not meeting its goals after 12 months. Are these applicable, or could they be applicable to this
To the question of who they might be and how many, actually the number of schools that would fail to make any positive growth, fail to make significant growth, is very tiny, because only 6 schools failed to make significant growth the first year. So all 6 would have, so it's going to be 6 or less. Yeah. So the number of schools that fail to reach this bar of at least some progress is very small. That being said, remember these are decile 1 schools, so the ones that fail to meet significant growth are not doing well. They have had no growth, and they're scoring pretty low. So in contrast to the other item and the other schools that can be actually performing up at the 5th or even risen a little bit to the 6th decile, but had the misfortune to fall back a year that triggers state monitoring. But again, that's the way the law reads on the other one. So
is there a law that reads on district schools much like the law that read on the other schools? In other words, the stringent kinds of things like revised attendance, et cetera,
Right.
Fire district
Sanctions.
reorganize the sanctions.
the law, in terms of your choice of sanctions, is the same for each program. You have the choice of the very much more stringent ones, or as an alternative, and this is the one that the board has taken so far with our recommendation, assigning a SATE team. You will always have that choice with all the schools that we bring before you. Yes, yes. No. Only for the IIUSP schools. For these schools we're talking about in this item, it would be premature by 12 months to do that, according to statute.
The sanctions or interventions are the same list.
Right.
For both programs, IIUSP and HP. The timeline is different in that HP is a little longer. So what you would have done in 2 years under IIUSP, you can't do until you reach 3 years under HP.
All right, I think I understand this now, but what I don't understand is that for the very lowest schools who are not performing and the kids who are not being educated properly or showing it anyway, that we are waiting longer to help them than it is for the schools who are, volunteering in the other program. I don't understand it.
Well, to that, that's because of the legislation.
Okay.
And because we seem to be very frustrated with a number of, with certain legislation, we were talking that since the Board of Ed, in cooperation with the Secretary of Ed or the Governor's policy arm, that Ruth, perhaps you and some board members and Ray, instead of just being reactive and a defense against legislation, maybe could be suggesting, with cooperation with Jack and his people, a legislative package on things we think are not working or could be improved upon.
And I just wanted
That would
to
be
point out.
welcome. Yes, would
I
like that
think-
opportunity very much.
Yeah, I think we're treating this academic program survey kind of lightly. If you take an opportunity to look at the survey, what it does is it focuses on 9 essential components. The 9 essential components have been major keys to moving students towards academic success. They focus on instructional materials, they focus on professional learning, use of diagnostic assessment, aligning your resources towards supporting your school plan. So by administering that survey locally, One of the things it does after 24 months is it cues what's going on with the school so that they can also begin to focus their work in a better way. And so I don't want us to take that too lightly. That's a good focus for the group.
I appreciate that. One comment building on what Stu just said, just for you to think about. I think that the 9 essential components, when you look at them, and Joe was involved in that process a lot as they were coming forward, that one thing you might think of is, well, when if you were developing a program like High Priority Schools, wouldn't you want those 9 essential components as a condition of entering into the program to get all that money, rather than let the school just make up something, and they're doing what they think is their best, and then going backwards and forcing them to do it? When you know those 9 things, like having the textbooks, having collaborative time, qualified teachers, kind of common sense things ought to be there at the front end.
Yeah.
And so that may be, in thinking of what Bonnie's describing, that's something that you might do. Now, that's not in the statute, right? So we didn't have that decision before us, but just to have the board think about that as you go forward with legislative ideas. Because they are very good, the 9 components.
Good, and they do get focused, so.
I had a question, and that is, I think not only the frustration, but the idea that the board would like to have some time to be a little more creative in how they look at this. Would it be possible, in light of the data that you're going to bring back in November, that they could make the decision on it at that time as
Sure.
opposed to now?
Sure.
Okay, that would be my suggestion for you.
Right. Clearly, there's a lot of interest here, and I think waiting and then coming back to the board with something would be more productive. Okay. Janine, you all right? Okay. Thank you very much, Sue and everyone else. Okay. Do we have I'm sorry, we had a public speaker on this? Oh, okay. Okay, you have 2 minutes. Maybe I should give you 1 for not saying, no, I'm kidding.
I decided I shouldn't introduce myself because I get longer time that way. On behalf of staff, what staff's actually trying to do, I think, on this is not wait till the 3 years is over and then deal with the issue. They're coming to you early in the process. It may not be as early as you would like, okay, but it's early. And I can then commend you for being concerned about these schools, because these are tough schools, and they're really our challenges and the ones we want to make. We want to see do well. The other point that, though, I would like to make on behalf of some of these schools, a lot of them, this program did not get implemented very well the first year, and a lot of the money didn't get out until very late in the process. And when I mean late, I'm talking about May and June late, and so the first year was a very hectic year, and it may seem that we call these schools the high priorities, but those schools didn't feel like they were the high priority, and they felt almost like the legislature didn't care about this program. So it's now in the ground. It's working very, very well. I really commend the excellent job the staff is doing, and I commend you for being concerned about these schools.
Thank you very much. I mean, this board is very concerned about these kids and academic achievement in general, and I'd like Ray just to take a comment here.
I just wanted a point of clarification that the reason the money didn't get out was not that the staff of the department was not working quickly. There were issues with finance and figuring out how much money was actually available, and that's what took a longer period of time. And those schools were happy to truncate the time frame to get the money, and so they actually all signed on for that. But I didn't want it to be, I didn't want people to think it was the department dragging their feet. In this instance, it clearly was not.
And all I've heard about, say, in the 9 essential elements, it's a very good intervention, well thought out, a lot of critical components. So to the extent that we can get the money that fuels this reform into schools as quickly as possible is a very helpful thing for these kids. Thank you. Okay, we are moving on, right? Okay. Okay, Alice Parker, item 24.
Good afternoon. Good to see you all. I'm bringing back yet again, hopefully for the last time, item 24, which is regulations for Title V regarding withholding funds to enforce special education compliance. This puts us in compliance with federal law, and the real good news is that it would put us in compliance even with a new reauthorization of federal law, so you wouldn't have to go through this again. We brought it to you in January, had a public hearing in March, went out for a 45-day public comment again, held another hearing in July, and then at your July board meeting, because there had been several comments, we went for a 15-day public comment period. We received comments from 2 individuals, one from Mr. Wenkart, who's General Counsel for Orange County Office of Education, who complimented us on the changes that we had made, so we